What does it mean for a wife to submit to her husband? What does it mean for the man to be the head of the wife? Those are the questions we're going to look at today as we study Ephesians chapter 6 with my guest, Mr. Brian Tingley. So we're going to start that right after this. So today I have the honor of a good friend of mine. We didn't grow up together, but we grew up our adult years together. His name is Brian Tingley, and we're going to be going through the book of Ephesians. Actually, we're going to be going through a section on the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, dealing with a marriage, husbands and wives. A very important topic to talk about when it comes to the church. Also very misunderstood. And so my friend Brian, who is a marriage and family therapist, is going to share some of his insights and some of his thoughts. We grew up together. We were both single. There were times where we were at a restaurant and we talked so long about relationships that they had to start sweeping around our feet to give us a hint to leave. So with that said, Brian, I'd love you to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do. So the floor is all yours.
Yeah, I remember back in those single days, it seemed like, we're talking about marriage. And now back then it was like, are we going to get married or will we ever meet anybody? But here we are a few years later and it worked out. But yeah, back then I was, pretty solid back when we were single together. I was solid in my faith and wanting to serve God. But part of what led me to be a counselor was I was saved and living life the best I knew as a Christian, but some things were confusing to me, and relationships was one of those. Not that I didn't have good relationships, but there was just a lot of things I felt like I should be better than I am, or relationships should be better. And so that eventually led me to becoming a counselor. I've had some Christian authors that I really respected, and so I got a little more into that and eventually went back to school. And so here I am.
And I know that you worked really hard. I remember those long trips to Seattle and then working at the KSTW news station and, putting on your little night, what are those called, blindfolds, and the aluminum foil on the window because you were just, you had a weird schedule and you were committed to finishing up and getting your degree and getting your hours in, which took like forever, it seemed like. And now here you are today and you have your own marriage and family therapy practice. So that's pretty impressive. It just shows you what you can do if you really put your mind to it. So today what I want to do, Brian, is just go through Ephesians chapter 6, 22 through 33, and it talks about husbands and wives. And so you want to get started?
Let's give this a shot.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and screen share, and hopefully this will work. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look, and hopefully this comes in on your side. Do you see Bible verses?
I do.
Yes?
I
okay.
do.
That's what I really wanted to know. So I just want to go ahead and start right here. It says, wives, submit to your husbands. And then it says, as to the Lord. And that's where I want to start at. I want to talk about the S word, submit. So what does that mean for wives to submit to their husbands? And why is there so much of a struggle when it comes to that term?
Yeah, well, first, I want to sort of give a disclaimer that the Bible is the standard for how we're supposed to live, and none of us meets the standard. And just because we can't meet the standard doesn't mean the standard doesn't exist, nor should it be minimized in any way. And so as a counselor, people come to me, a lot of my clients are Christians, and they come to me feeling like they've failed or feeling like they're not meeting the standard of what they think they should do in their life. And so the scriptures are very serious, and the standard that God sets is very high. And sometimes it can seem so high that maybe we miss something, but the Bible is clear on many things and just hard to live out sometimes. So when it comes to submission, I think that it's one of those words that can be misunderstood. But you got to realize too, we kind of look at some of these things through our own American modern day interpretation of the world. And it was written 2,000 years ago, and that in a different culture. So it does have to be interpreted. But I think first that husbands are behaving the way that God designed them to behave, which is to love their wives. Something like submission is not as scary of a word. I think a good leader, people will follow a good leader because they trust the leader, and the leader has earned that trust. And I think submission in a marriage there's a similar sort of feel to it. Not that we go by feelings, but when a husband is loving his wife well, submitting to that husband is not such a scary thing. The wife trusts the husband. The wife is feeling loved and cared for by the husband. And so submission is yielding to another person. And so wives are to yield to their husbands, and husbands are to lead and to love. And when husbands are doing their job well, wives usually respond to that really, really well.
Yeah, I like that. I like that emphasis. When you're talking about the model, the standards, kind of putting someone before yourself, putting others before yourself. And just the idea, like you're saying, that if the husbands do their part, if they actually, love the wife like Christ loved the church, the submission part probably becomes more second nature. It's probably something that nobody really fights, but as you know, today our world is filled with distorted messages about what actually true submission really is. And, so I see this really played out. Think about it like at Gethsemane, here's an example. Like, God doesn't tell us to do something that he's not willing to do himself. And I think about Gethsemane, and Jesus was in the most difficult time of his life, sweating blood, trying to say, Lord, if there's another way, take this cup from me. One of the most vulnerable times in his life, but he has such a relationship with the Father that he trusts him. And he knows that whatever decision that he's going to make is going to be best for him. And so I love that part where he just says, you know what? I'm going to model what it means to submit to somebody that I trust, that has been there, that has given life to people, that is the truth. And he says, but not my will, but your will. And so I really like that. That seems like that's what it's supposed to look like. Is you're going to want to follow someone if you know that they're trustworthy, they have good character, and most importantly, that your interest is put before them.
Well said.
So, Brian, how is it supposed to look? And why isn't it more natural today?
There's a lot of reasons, I think, why something like submitting, or even husbands loving their wives, it doesn't happen more naturally. And certainly a big theme in the Bible is sin, and which separates us from God. And then how do we get back into right relationship with God? And when things are working the way they're supposed to work, things are pretty simple and things work really, really well. It gets really, really complicated when you put sin into the equation. And so what would normally be, if you think about a parent that loves a child well, the child responds pretty well. But when something breaks down and trust is broken, then it starts to get a little more complicated. And I think that it's harder to, I think the commands in the Bible can be difficult at times, something like submitting, because we're not perfect. And so there's sin that enters the world. And as a counselor, there's a lot of other things we look at, like how somebody was raised and what their value systems are and what they were taught, what the culture says. So I think there's a lot of contributing factors, but it started way back in the garden when trust was broken by first disobeying God, and then all kinds of problems came in relationally after that.
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of things, and we'll hit on the garden in a moment. But I always say that if you want the answers to life, go back to the garden, and you can see where they started to develop. So I like that answer. So now what I want to do, Brian, is, so we talked about the S word. So I want to talk about the H word now, or pardon me, the H word. It is the H word.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about that. And so, because it's not just the submission part that is the problematic thing when it comes to people, but it actually also revolves around the headship. So it says here, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. So, Brian, how is headship, how is it similar and distinct from submission? And why is headship important, or is it important?
Let me make a comparison here. I heard several months ago a comment made by a speaker about a calling is sort of a burden. If you think about Mary, the mother of Jesus, she was called to be the mother of Jesus, but that was quite a burden to carry. And on the other side of it, where we know the outcome, it sounds pretty good being, hey, I was Mary, the mother of Jesus, but she went through a lot with that calling.
Yeah.
And I think headship is like a calling. We are called as husbands to lead and to care for the whole family, care for the wife and care for the family. So there's a responsibility with that comes with knowing how to love well, care well, sacrifice, and lead. And there's a lot of intentionality in that. First Peter mentions husbands live with your wives with understanding. So there's something about husbands needing to be intentional about understanding their wife, understanding their family, and then knowing how to lead and be ahead of the family with that calling.
It's good. That's good. That's good. When I think about headship, just from a pastoral perspective, again, I start with the premise that Jesus doesn't ask us to do something he's not willing to do, So we talked about submission, just this idea of considering others better than yourself, But when it comes to headship, there's a section in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, where Paul is actually talking about head coverings, which is seems to be more of a tradition at that particular time in the church. But in the process, he uses head coverings to talk about headship. And this is what he says. He says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. And so you see this again, like Jesus, he doesn't just tell us to do something to make us mad, but he actually models what that is like. And so I like that idea that when this headship term is used, like in the Bible, it's not used in the sense of men are superior to women, but it's used in the sense that it revolves around roles. When God creates humanity, for example, when he creates humanity, he creates them in his image, male and female. So the equality is always stated right up front. And many people don't like that today, Brian, because they think of gender as a social construct. But when it comes to God, when it comes to the Bible, God is very careful, not only in creating gender, but also establishing gender roles. And when we disobey them, that's when the whole trouble starts to manifest itself.
Yeah, you mentioned about headship and roles and God having those roles. I think it's like a coach of a team. They each have their position, and if you're playing your position well and you know your position, it's going to work out pretty good. And I think that's how it works in marriage. God's designed it that way. And the thing, there's the culture wars going on around gender, and it's a pretty heated topic in our world these days. But I like to make the distinction between gender and biological sex, because those are sort of used interchangeably. And really, biological sex is the scientific fact that we're genetically different, and science proves that. Science tells us what is. It doesn't tell us how it's supposed to be, but it tells us what is. So it says there's male and female genetically, and we're wired differently. And the thing about trying to be the opposite sex is that it will never satisfy. And I think people can feel like they're going to get ripped off if they want. Gender is considered expression, how I'm expressing my maleness or my femaleness, and I see this in counseling. This is a very practical thing for me, that there's there's generalities. We're all unique, but there's generalities that seem pretty consistent with women, and there's generalities that are very consistent with men. And I see that all the time, where women don't have to apologize for being women and having certain needs emotionally, relationally, and with intimacy, and men don't have to apologize for being sort of how they're wired. They want to achieve and conquer and provide, for example. And when those get too crossed, now there's always exceptions in terms of how somebody's living or their lifestyle or certain circumstances call for different things, but it doesn't change the design of how God intended for it to be. And so God knows what's best for us. He's not trying to gyp us, and he's not trying to rip us off. He knows how we're going to be most fulfilled. And so really, when you cooperate with that, you're going to get much more of really what deep down you're longing for.
Yeah, I like that analogy of the coach and the players have their roles. And I mean, you see it a lot of times in football. The lineman misses his block. The quarterback is on the floor doing a lip stand, So I like that analogy. I like that. So anyway, so let's go for the jugular now. I want to look at this passage, and again, we've touched on this already, but it communicates something that a lot of let's just say a lot of women, they don't appreciate, and it's hard. So in verse 24, it says, "Now as the church submits to Christ, also the wives should submit in everything to their husbands." Man, in everything, Brian. So let me back up again. Before we start getting on that, what everything is, why do you think that Paul addresses wives first?
That's one of those questions that, as a counselor, I probably would only say something that is not going to be accurate. So what I can say is, just from experience, again, experience is not the standard. The Bible is the standard. So there's a reason why Paul lays things out. But I think women reflect a side of God that is more naturally and intuitively feels the need to be close emotionally and feels the need to be in a relationship. And I think that that's not a mystery. If you listen to women talk relationally, they're very relational people. I'm not saying that men aren't relational. They're just relational in a different way. And when men miss their position of loving and caring and leading well, I think that can bring insecurity into a marriage. So we're talking about marriage. And that could be very confusing and insecure for a wife. And she can maybe sometimes want to take over. And there's times where that's warranted, where a man is missing certain things, or a husband is, and the wife has no choice but to step in and sometimes take over. And it's not a competition. It's how do you work together? And so I think Paul's warning that let's get back to the standard. The standard is that men are supposed to love, or husbands are supposed to love well, and wives are to be partnering in marriage and in family life and in life. And so I think Paul is just warning something that's probably very confusing to a woman, which is, don't you understand me? Don't you love me? Don't you feel the need for connection? And so when that's not happening, I think it's like, hey, caution, let's get back to the model. Your husband is supposed to love you. And if you're suffering, that's something he needs to know about. But let's get him loving better. Let's get him leading better. Let's get him sacrificing better. Let's get him moving towards a Christ likeness in marriage and in family, and work towards that. And that can be a messy process as a counselor. It can be another confusing journey, because a lot of husbands that I know of, they don't feel very confident as husbands, and they don't feel very confident in their families. And I think they need help and support to know how to do that. And I don't know that I think they do a lot of things well. I mean, I'm thinking of husbands that do a lot of things well, but they don't feel that they're doing things well. So I think it takes a little coaching to get back, get to the Bible, figure out what the Bible says, get to the standard. And then sometimes it's helpful to have somebody, a pastor or a relationship expert, or in my case, as a counselor, help people get on track and moving in the right direction.
So, do you think that passive husbands have been a problem in the church?
I think that, as you mentioned earlier, ever since the fall, there seems to be a theme of men sort of not stepping into their role and leading well. And when they do not lead well, something has to fill in the gap. And that, I think that it can happen anywhere, including the church. And I think that the church is lacking in leadership. Of course, there's great leaders everywhere, and God's people are everywhere. But I think also men sometimes feel like they don't know where they fit in church, or they maybe put more into their careers and maybe aren't as aware of their calling or their need to be active and involved in the church as well.
That's really good. Yeah. You know, when I think of that verse that we just read now, I think of the part that really makes women uncomfortable. And that's this idea of submit to your husband in everything. And, you know, when I think about that, I think sometimes there's misconceptions on the men's part, the male's part, when it comes to that, because husbands are never commanded to rule their wives. You know, they're commanded to love them. And when it comes to headship, it's not self-exalting, but it's other-oriented again. And I think you've talked about that theme that happens over and over again. And headship, it also doesn't mean issuing commands, you know, thus saith the husband, do this. I think sometimes that there's men that really, they want to be the spiritual leader, but they're really not trained in the Bible. They're really not sure exactly what that means. Maybe they've heard that talk before. And also, you know, headship doesn't necessarily mean that a woman can't make the final decision. And,
Absolutely.
you know, kind of unpack that, because there's this idea like, I have to be the one, it has to be mine. But sometimes a woman is better at a certain decision-making process than a man.
I was just going to mention like the example of Christ again. I mean, if God is all powerful, all knowing, and there's nothing, everything is perfect about him, then what does that look like when he comes to earth? So he comes to earth and he serves and he leads and he gives. And the Bible is very clear that we are individuals, that we have wills and we get to exercise them. So I think if God is our example for how to love and how to be the head, he certainly gives his bride, which is the church, a lot of leeway to live their life and make decisions. And it's no different with husband and wife. Of course, the wife's going to be good at some things better than the man. So it's a partnership, and it's a working together and that harmony where it's not a power struggle. It's a working together, and when it's working the way it's supposed to, it fits well.
Good. That's good. You know, I was doing some reading by a pastor named Sam Storms, and it was a good article on headship because, you know, it's good sometimes just to kind of get some outside perspective. And one of the things that he said, he talked about the essence of headship, which I never really categorized it as that, but there were 4 things that he said. Maybe see what you think about it. But he said headship is more of a responsibility than a right. Headship is a God-given authority to serve your wife. Headship is an opportunity to lead biblically. Headship is an opportunity to allow the wife to decide in certain instances. And so what do you think about some of those statements that Sam Storms wrote about?
You know, if sometimes I say there's not really a race for loving and serving. I mean, who's going to stop somebody from serving? Who's going to stop somebody from loving well? There's no lack of need for the role of loving well to be implemented or exercised. And I think what you're saying is in headship, if you're taking that responsibility seriously, you know, it comes with serving, and the biblical model for that is to serve. And so I believe when anybody, a husband or any Christian for that matter, is being Christ-like, it's not a hard thing to want to be involved with that. It's a pretty attractive person to want to get closer, to get to know, because they're watching out for you. And that's part of what our headship is. We're watching out for our wives. Back to that first that First Peter, was it 3:7, understanding your wives. I mean, if there's intentionality about, I want what's best for my wife, I want what's best for my kids, I'm going to work very, very
Yeah.
hard for that. It's pretty hard to not want to cooperate with that and feel the benefits of that.
One of the errors of headship, and I don't know, I've had people tell me about this, is that, and I've seen it, is that sometimes the husband feels like he has to remind his wife that the Bible talks about him being the head and that she's supposed to submit. And I always think, you know what? I think she knows that. She knows that verse. That's probably like a John 3:16 verse in her head. And sometimes the way that it's framed makes her definitely not want to even consider doing that. So what do you think about just a husband using that tactic?
I think that if we go back to our roles, what's your position, and play your position. Jesus said, take the speck out of your own eye before you take the log out of somebody else's. I think we can apply that in marriage as well. What do I need to do to love better? My kids, one of my sons way back when, I found him to be a very effective liar. And I thought to myself, how did I teach him to lie? And I realized, I just sort of came to the conclusion that he lies because it works. And so I have to find a better way to help him meet his needs other than him doing it his way. And so that required me to understand him more, get in his world more, and really see what he was after. And I think that if we have to tell our wives that we're the heads, I think we're probably lacking in our leadership skills in some way, or lacking in our love skills some way. Not that there isn't a place for confrontation or giving feedback. Of course there is. But again, I think we can look at ourselves, us husbands can look at ourselves and say, wow, what am I missing? How do I love better if my wife is not responding?
That's really good, Brian. That's really good. Just to work through that. So let's go forward a little bit and look at some more scripture and just kind of talk it through a little bit. On the next section here, we're just going to go through 25 through 27, where it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that he might be holy, without blemish. So Paul gives this statement that I think husbands don't think about until later. And that is that husbands are supposed to love their wives like Christ loved the church. And I think to most husbands, that sounds like really overwhelming, right? Because we know how much Christ sacrificed and how much he loved us. What would make our wives feel love like that? It seems to be saying, this is what I got out of this, Brian. Okay. When I read this, and I've read this many, many times, but I came to the conclusion, Paul's saying that we should love our wife like the gospel. Like the gospel of Jesus Christ. Anyway, what are some of your thoughts just in that whole section about loving your wives as Christ loved the church, doing things to, he uses the term sanctify her, washing her with the water of the word. And the goal is that she will be better for it, right? She'll be holy without blemish. That Paul's kind of merging kind of his conclusion together, I think, and this is my opinion, with the gospel, like we're supposed to love our wives like Jesus loved the church. So you got any thoughts, any comments just on that section there? Anything you want to add to the discussion?
Yeah, I think it feels overwhelming and sounds overwhelming because it is. Again, the standard is pretty high that we're, as husbands, are supposed to be Christ-like and sacrificial in that way. And I remember there's a great book on marriage called Sacred Marriage. I'm sure you've heard of it. But when I read that book, it really sort of laid out in a very compelling and I think convincing way that marriage sort of has an eternal mission. There's a calling in marriage that transforms us for eternity. We're not just loving our wives because they're going to be happier. Of course, we'd want that to happen, but there's really there's sort of an eternal mission in it, and there's a calling to it. And, Paul says, the Bible, the law points us to the need for a savior. I mean, we cannot do this. So in the end, we still have to rely on God's power and keep moving towards the goal. The goal is to love like Christ. And so we get up every day and give it a new energy, a new fresh beginning. And we can do that in our own, but we really need to rely on God and with his power, yes, but also with an eternal perspective. We're not doing this just for now. We're not doing this for just today. We're doing this for eternity, because it's changing us, it's changing our wives, it's changing our families, and something much bigger is happening than just sort of a temporary, hey, we feel good about each other.
It's really interesting that Jesus and God just shows us what it means to have character in ways that we probably wouldn't have even considered, And, when Jesus says something like, hey, I didn't come here to be served, but to serve others, it's like, what? You're Jesus. You're from heaven. You're perfect. And so again, he does not ask us to do something he's not willing to do himself. All right, well, let's look at verses 28 through 30. We're getting there. We're getting to verse 33. So let's look at this and then just ponder and talk a little bit more about it. So in verse 28, it starts off here. It says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. So Brian, I got to confess something to you. I'm not really feeling my body lately. Okay. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I think, man, am I pregnant? And so, I'm thinking, what is he talking about? Love your wife like Christ, or love your wife like you love your body. Help me to understand that and to break that down, Brian.
Well, again, I'm not a theologian, so I know you well enough to know that you can break that down much better than I can. But I think with sort of some obvious sort of anecdotal maybe lens on this, if you think about your body, if you don't take care of it, it's gonna let you know. If you don't get sleep, you're gonna get tired. If you don't give it food, you're gonna be hungry. If you give it bad food, you're gonna have a stomach ache. And so the body's telling us all the time to take care of it. And I think there's something about the messaging here that it's kind of obvious that if you don't take care of your body, something bad is going to happen. And I think in our marriage and loving our wives, it's the same thing. It's like, if you don't take care of your wife, if you don't love your wife, if you don't lead your family, if you're not being Christ-like, it's going to catch up with you, and there's going to be some outcomes that aren't going to be favorable to you. So, nobody sort of in their right mind abuses their body. There's all kinds of reasons in a fallen world why people do that, but that's not sort of the natural, intuitive thing. You care for your body. So, yeah, as we get older, it's breaking down. Our body isn't the greatest, but I think that when we take care of it intentionally, we do better. And I think that's obviously when we love well our wives, it's going to be favorable to her and to ourselves.
Deal. Good deal. I think I get it. Although I don't like my body right now as much as I used to like it, I still love it in the sense that I feed it, I exercise, I give it sleep, like you mentioned. I want to take care of my body so that I can have a longer life, so I can live longer. And of course, that's Lord willing. But I love my body enough to say I want to live. I think it's an interesting concept when you think of it in terms of what Paul's talking about, because this passage, Brian, it's so biblically inspired. We heard that word, it's inspired from God. It's like how Paul puts this together, and given the fact that he's single, it blows me away. But I should love my wife in such a way that she thrives, that we have a long marriage, a long life, a long marriage, and it's kind of like, I start to slack on like my eating. I start to eat junk food. I step on the scale and it says to be continued. It's like, if I treat my marriage in the same way, it's like I'm not being disciplined. I'm not like putting in the effort. I'm being lazy, and then that's what makes our marriage sometimes go out of whack. And then to stretch that metaphor even further, it's like Paul goes, and Jesus, is the head of the body, the head of the church. And he loved the church so much, Brian. He loved his body so much, and this is hard to understand, that he actually was willing to be crucified for us. Like that's how much, and it talks about that the church are his bride. And so he loved his body so much that he allowed himself to be crucified on the cross because he wanted us to be able to have eternal life with him and the Father. I mean, like that's how much he loves his body that he gave it up for us. Again, it's profound to even think of that as a reality. So there's a lot of good stuff in here, I want to look at some of these last verses, and this has been fun. It's been fun to kind of talk through the scriptures here and to have a professional like yourself, kind of guide us and give us your insight here. So I want to go ahead and read 31 through 33. And so it starts here. It says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects the husband." One thing that's also evident in that passage, it quotes the garden. Remember, we talked about how the garden, everything goes back to the garden. Like Jesus quoted that during his time because he was having a big problem with people taking the side of Hillel versus Shammai, in the sense that you could divorce your wife for any reason, And Jesus says it wasn't. And then Moses issued a certificate of divorce, and Jesus is like, it wasn't that way from the beginning. The two became one flesh. So I love how that timeless principle, it just keeps showing up in the scriptures. And then what I like about Paul here is he kind of does the switcheroo, if you will. So like husbands are, first of all, the thing I notice is that husbands get the big long section, like the wives get the more controversial section, right? And that tells me that yeah, don't focus on this, but focus on this. Like every time when I was learning Bible and hermeneutics, they would say, the stuff that's the meatiest is the one that has the most content on it. And definitely it comes to the man. That's what's happening here. And then, Paul does the switcheroo to the husband, and he's like saying, it's to both of them, but to me, it's more to the husband. It's like, oh, by the way, I'm not just talking about your wife. I'm talking about this mystery. It's profound. This is how Christ loved the church. And so just thinking about that, Brian, there's been so many times in my relationship with Michelle that she's done something and I have completely overreacted because I didn't like what she was doing. And, sometimes I just become stubborn, and I'm like, you know what? I don't want to talk about it. I was right. I was this, I was that. And then I read this passage. And Paul says, love your wife like Christ loved the church. And when I actually take time to slow down and process that and think about that, I'm like, I haven't done that. I'm so focused on what I want, because Christ's love was loving the other, putting the other first. And that's really a way, that's my gauge when it comes to my marriage, is like, am I loving my wife like Christ loved the church? Too many times I have to say no. And then I have to like backtrack and say, hey, I was wrong. And it's always hard for me to do that because I'm a prideful person, and that's to my detriment, but it's also the thing that actually frees the relationship, when you can do that. So, well, I want to look at the last verse again. We looked at it briefly, but I think it's worth commenting on. In verse 33, he says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. One of the things that I notice with Jesus is he loved people, right? But he also seemed to respect people. And you're talking about like someone that has leprosy or someone that was caught in the act of adultery. Somehow Jesus loves and respects. Does anybody condemn you? Neither do I. And so I don't know. I just thought about that right now. There's like just right now as we're talking, I never even had that in my mind, but how would you just this idea, you would expect her to say, okay, wives, love your husbands, but Paul ends by saying, respect your husband. Yeah, I was just, I was thinking about that for myself. And when I feel respected, I feel loved. It's just, that's just how I'm wired. Like if I don't feel respected, I get angry or I get prideful. And, I've heard people say, well, the woman needs love and the man needs respect. I can understand that, but I think for me, it's like, if I'm respected, I feel loved. Like that's the way of me feeling what it means to be loved. Oh, there's a lot of stuff in that passage. There's a lot of things to think through. We did it. We went through Ephesians 5:22 through 33. I think I may have said Ephesians 6 before, but that's because I had a typo. And so what I like to do at the end of a podcast, or if I'm talking to someone that's a professional like you are, is ask you basically, what are some takeaways that you think would be helpful for us who are watching this to walk away with? What do you think are things that are just significant for us from your perspective? And if you like to, Brian, you can do like you did when we were younger, when you said, do you want the short answer or the long answer? And the long answer was this, okay, here we go. So anyway, the floor is yours. What are some of the nuggets? What are some of the things that you want us to walk away with today?